get started with the meeting. All four current board members are present. Laura Bosey, John Martin, Heath Sallet, and myself, Eric Worth, who's the chair. We have one item on the agenda, one application for 34 Kimball Avenue. And we are having a public hearing on the application tonight. So let's start the hearing. This concerns request to open a preschool. Karen, let me just restate the background. The applicant applied for a building permit and the building inspector rejected it. And she cited, let me look at it here. She cited section 134-7A, which says that in the R1 zone, which is where this building is located, schools must meet State Department of Education requirements, and that the school proposed by the applicant is licensed by an agency other than the State Department of Education. So given that background, Karen, would you like to explain to us, you've submitted your application is a request for an interpretation, meaning that you are challenging the building inspector's reading of the code, and you are arguing that, in fact, your proposal conforms with the provision that I just mentioned. So would you like to explain to us your reasons?
I'm going to let Beth Sigler, who is the architect for Kim Connor, talk on my behalf.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. I am just going to read a brief statement, so make sure I hit all of the right points. The reason that we believe that we're asking for the interpretation is that under the code, it says the permitted uses are schools meeting State Department education requirements. So the building inspector referred the application to the Zoning Board of Appeals, stating that we're converting an event space to a daycare, and daycares are not licensed by the New York State Department of Education. In New York State, the Office of Children and Family Services license is daycare. They also license preschools because of the age of the children, but preschools with qualified teachers who provide adequate education and maintain health and safety standards can voluntarily register with the New York State Department of Education since 1957. Mandatory registration was required until 1948, but it was changed at that point. The Foundry Montessori Preschool will provide education for 15 to 20 children, ages 3 to 6, 5 full days a week from 8:30 to 3. The Montessori philosophy emphasizes sensory hands-on learning with a mixed age group environment and trained teachers. Karen is currently undergoing the licensing process with the Office of Family Services and the registration with the New York State Department of Education. After both agencies review and approve her application, the school will be registered with the New York State Department of Education, and it will have to comply with regulations outlined in the New York State Education Law, Section 207, Chapter 2, Subchapter F, Part 125, which provides the regulations for educational programs, staffing, regulations for the building, health and safety requirements. And I provided a copy of this to the ZBA for their reference. So by registering through this voluntary program, we believe that the Foundry Montessori School is permitted in the R1 district. The language of the zoning code does not call for a school to be licensed by the NYSED, but to meet the New York State SED requirements. And some precedents in zoning law: in most municipalities, educational institutions and religious institutions are permitted in residential districts as there are complementary uses that exist for the public's benefit, A few examples are the Community Nursery School and Learning Center at 10 Academy Street, in the Presbyterian Church is in the R1 zoning district. The Buonas Montessori School is located at 224 Main in the R1 zoning district. It was in operation for about 20 years. Haldane K through 12 is in the R1 district. Hudson Hills Montessori Academy in Beacon at 60 Liberty Street, also in a residential district. The New York State Department of Education provides a directory for voluntarily registered non-public nursery schools and kindergartens. Sorry. The majority of these schools in neighboring counties are in residential zoning districts where the use is permitted as of right or with a special use permit. We also believe that the school provide many benefits to the community and follow several goals laid out in the comprehensive plan. Foremost, the school fulfills a need for early education in the village. The school will utilize an existing building, which will require only minor alterations since it was extensively renovated in 2015. It was brought up to current building code, energy code, and is ADA compliant. The proposed school is located in a walkable and bikeable area of the village. It has on-site parking that's required by code, and there's ample municipal parking nearby. And the preschool will also take advantage of the nearby West Point Foundry Preserve as an outdoor classroom. And as stated in the comprehensive plan, that's one of the goals, is to use the Hudson River and nature as much as possible for education. And so that's why those are the reasons that we are asking for the interpretation.
Thank you, Beth. And let me just mention, I forgot to say this at the opening, but I received and checked the mailing receipts for notices to neighbors. And we've also received the affidavit of the sign, the posting of the sign outside the property. So those two requirements are in order. And in addition, a hearing on an interpretation is a type 2 action under SECRA. So there no further environmental review is called for this application. It seems that there are members of the public here. Is anyone here to speak about the application? Stacy, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Stacy Morrison. I am the resident who owns the property immediately adjacent to 34 Kemble. I live at 36 Kemble. I bought the property about 2 years ago. Previously, I lived in Garrison for 5 years. Very familiar with the building's use. As the old VFW, I took dog training lessons there and attended a few other events. So I purchased this residential property, understanding it to be an occasional community use, and had the conversation with the owner of the property, Karen Connor, who mentioned when we first met that her plans for the occasional community use hadn't panned out as she had hoped, meaning that there weren't a lot of events. Fine in casual conversation. So then Phillipstown moved in the clerk office into the building. I didn't get notice about that. It would have been polite, but that's fine. And it's an all-day use, and it's a very quiet use. And it's, I think, more appropriate to this neighborhood with the occasional traffic of people coming. I only had someone park in my driveway once, and I survived. I have some pretty significant concerns about considering rezoning. The first point would be one, that I work from home and I'm a writer. There's a certain amount of noise I think was reasonable to expect. I also have a dog, a large dog, who likes to bark at noise, particularly children. There is only 15 feet between our buildings, And in fact, my backyard is only 3.5 feet from the building in the back, which is the big room, which is sort of the main room. When I bought the home, I understood the community use, but I think all day daily use with children and all of the parking and coming and going is very different. And the site seems ill-suited to a daycare and school for me, given the way that traffic will roar down the street to the Foundry. There's no sidewalks. I can't begin to comprehend how, I'm sure Karen has a plan because certainly she's experienced and a teacher, but how she would be conveying 3 to 6-year-olds the 2.5 miles down to the Foundry, since there are no sidewalks or anything there. But truly for me, changing the R1 effectively widows my property because of the way it is. It's the VFW and me and nothing else on my side of the street. So if that turns into a property where there's a lot of traffic, there's signage, there's people in and out, it greatly impacts my resale potential. And again, I think it widows my property. The other daycares that were cited that are in R1, they have significant clearances. They have much more property. There are offsets between the R1 and where the daycare is in almost all cases. And I think that there are other spaces in town, they're not as close to the Foundry, but again, don't quite understand that. For example, there's the Healing Arts building on Marion Street, which has very broad offset from the residential properties around it and is actually already zoned for this kind of use. I understand and respect Mrs. Kapoor's desire to open this school, but I think that the way that it would really significantly negatively impact my property and my day-to-day life is worthy of consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a public hearing, so members of the public are welcome to speak, but let me just clarify a little more the nature of this particular application. This application is different from most of the ones we receive. Usually what we receive are requests for variances, which are exceptions, requests for exceptions from the code. In this case, the applicant has asked for an interpretation, meaning that in request for interpretation, what the board does is examine the relevant provisions of the code, determine what they mean, and then examine the facts in the applicant's proposal and see if those facts conform to the code provision. The applicant is not asking for any change of zoning or any exception. She's arguing that she has the right to open this school as of right, without any exception or any change. And she's asking the board to listen to her argument in that direction and consider whether. So unlike with a variance application, the board does not take into account factors like the merits of the worthiness of the proposed use or the effect on the community, the benefit or potential harm to the community. All of those factors are come into play with variances. In the case of an interpretation, we're merely looking at the letter of the code and seeing whether the facts comply or not.
Correct. Thank you. Understood.
All right. Would anyone else like to speak?
No, I would not. I am simply here as an observer.
All right. I guess we have no other speakers, and the board received a number of letters from other members of the public commenting on the application. But again, I'm not going to dwell on them because for the reasons I stated before. The board should, in fact, should not allow itself to be influenced by arguments for and against the merits of the project. We just are supposed to focus on the law itself. Do board members have any questions for the applicant or comments so far?
Not me.
Well, I
I
have
have a-
one.
Oh, go for
Oh,
it,
go
Heath.
ahead,
I'll
Laura.
ask after.
Oh, go ahead.
S- is it correct that that you're in the process of applying to the Department of Education this kind of voluntary application? Maybe could you just, if that's the case, could you just explain what that application looks like and what the department required of you?
The zoning approval is part of the application. So I'm not able to finish my application either to Office of Child and Family Services or to New York State Department of Education until I have this approval and all the inspections and things that will follow the approval. And so I'm kind of stuck. I haven't been able to move either application forward until this process is finished. But right now, it's an extensive application for the OCFS. It's an online application. It has several requirements, the capacity, the site plans, the fire safety plan, evacuation plan, all these, and then the other educational piece too, everything with our educational philosophy, and all those elements as well. Outdoor, how I'm planning, like Stacy asked, how I'm planning to use the outdoors. And so I have to give detailed outlines of how I'm getting there. So I have like maps and routes.
Laura, the application was posted online, so you can see what it entails and all the requirements. So
Oh, great.
we put that on along with other information from the New York State Department of Education.
Thank you. Thank you.
Beth, with what you have online, I know I can see the PDF for the historical use, but I haven't been able to thoroughly look into it yet. Is it validated that the historical use, again, was that it was used for an education purpose in the past?
It's been used for multiple purposes. So it has had children's programs run through Phillipstown Rec. Mommy and Me, Music Together, yoga, lots of other kids programs. So we try to, the document is updated from when we renovated the building in 2015. So we tried to document all the uses. We've updated it with uses since then. But that outlines a variety of uses since that time.
Sure. That makes sense. I mean, and then, I know it was referenced earlier that it was, is the clerk's office. So, it's certainly, being used for even items like, I guess, marriages right now, right? So it's
Oh, and I hope not.
no? Well, I don't mean for a ceremonial thing, but items such as getting your paperwork. So official business. Okay.
Sure.
And then just one other question, referencing what the decision was that sent the interpretation to us, is it, and I apologize if I don't mean to be making a statement here, but it sounds like it may have been a misclassification of the decision to call it a daycare, because it's not, correct?
Correct. We will not, I will not have any child under the age of 3.
Right.
They are required by OCFS to turn 3 by December of the school year. So every child will be potty trained. There's no changing of diapers, no cribs. I will actually not even be having naps. My program is designed so the 3-year-olds leave half day and go home to nap, to enable me to take the older children, the 4 and 5-year-old children, outdoors to explore, like outlined in our plan on our website, to use the Foundry Preserve, but not just the Foundry Preserve, but to walk in the village and, explore in the community as well.
And Heath, one of the main reasons why that misclassification is happening is because Montessori works with mixed age groups. And which means is that in a classroom, you would have 3-year-old and 6-year-olds. And that classification of a 3-year-old by New York State is kind of, because they, a 3-year-old would have a separate classroom in a traditional classroom. That's why it was misinterpreted. But I think we've given you some documentation which shows a byline which says that New York State recognizes Montessori schools. We actually found that labeling, which we didn't know when we initially filed with the application. So it should be there in the documentation.
Thank you.
Karen, can you speak about the similarities or differences between the requirements of the OFCS and the Department of Education?
The OCFS deals with children under the age of 6. That's the age just determines their jurisdiction, right? So they are mostly working with daycares and preschools. The minute you have a classroom with children aged above 6, because kindergarten is not mandated by New York State. So even though I have kindergartners, that's not a mandated program. So if I was to fall under New York State Department of Education exclusively, I would have to have children over the age of 6. So grades first 1 to 12, for example, like Haldane. There are schools like the school I currently work at that have the preschool class that I'm proposing. And in addition to that, they have grades 1 to 8, or Manitou is another example. So those schools fall under New York State Department of Education because they have the older children, even though they have the younger children also. They are not now answerable to OCFS anymore. They fall under just New York State Department. So for me, just because I'm just starting up, I plan on, and that's my qualification. I have Montessori training for 3 to 6-year-olds specifically. So I'm only planning on having a classroom for that age group. And which is why now I have to go with OCFS. But when I initially went to register the school, I went to New York State Department of Education, and in the guidelines was you need licensing by OCFS in order to apply for the New York State Department. What was it called, Beth? The voluntary registration.
Yes.
Because it's preschool, it's just a voluntary registration. I'm not licensed by the New York State Department, just registering with them.
What I'm wondering about is, in practical terms, in order to get the license from the OCFS, you have to meet certain requirements. And in order to qualify for voluntary registration under the Education Department, you also have to meet certain requirements.
Right.
I'm just wondering, in practical terms, is there overlap between those requirements? Are they different or similar?
Very similar as far as the health and safety requirements are concerned, which is why I need all those inspections and that kind of thing. But in addition to all the OCFS requirements, what New York State looks at is the educational component. So they're asking me for extensive reports on my curriculum and everything that I'm going to be teaching in the school. If that makes sense. Yeah. OCFS is more concerned with health and safety because, they're mostly looking at daycares.
Well, I looked at the section in the New York Codes, Rules, and Regulations, which the applicant cited, and that's part 125. And this is in the chapter regarding, these are regulations promulgated by the Department of Education. So this entire section of the code is agency regulations from the Department of Education, and section 125, which deals with this voluntary registration of non-public nursery schools and kindergartens. That's the one that Karen is seeking. And the language here in this code section reads, a school shall be registered by the department upon the submission of satisfactory evidence that it meets the standards set forth in this part and receives approval after on-site visitation. So there, so in other words, to achieve the voluntary registration, the applicant must meet standards set forth by the Department of Education. That I was struck by the similarity between that language and what we find in our zoning code, which says that the school must meet requirements of the Department of Education. Board members have anything else they'd like to ask or remark on?
Yeah, so as far as the interpretation issue that's before us, everything that Beth spoke of, which I took notes of and looked through a lot of this information, that's the basis of their argument in support of the interpretation that 134.7a would apply to what they're seeking.
Well, actually, that's a good point, because
Seeking a definition of this anyway, an interpretation, that's primarily.
Yeah, I think there are two arguments that are kind of intertwined here, and it's important for us to keep them separate. One of them rests on the idea that the applicant is in fact meeting requirements promulgated by the Department of Education through this voluntary registration. That's argument number one. And the other argument is that the building has a pre-existing non-conforming use that is being continued in this school. This school is merely a continuation of a pre-existing non-conforming use. So that's an entirely separate and unrelated argument. And the applicant only needs to prevail on one of those, and should choose one for us to focus on, or she could, I guess she could leave them both open. And I mean, regarding the second one, I think there's a little bit of a little more headway in that argument, because the applicant would need to convincingly show that there's the same use is from VFW Hall, which a association of veterans, to a school, a preschool, the applicant would have to show that that's the same use, because the code is quite clear when it talks about pre-existing non-conforming uses in 134-19. It says, no non-conforming use shall be enlarged or extended. So in other words, you can, if you have a use in place before the code is adopted, you can continue it, but you may not enlarge it or extend it without making it conform. You can't go further in a non-conforming direction. So that to me, it makes that argument a little more tenuous, a little harder to accept. Beth?
I agree that we're really looking for the education, the first use, that it is regulated by New York State Department of Education. But I would also argue that since that is allowed in the district, that you would be bringing the use into conformance. So you're not extending a non-conforming use, you're actually making a use that is in conformance with the code. So I'm not sure that that's where we were headed with that. We're just really highlighting that it is a community use, that it has fulfilled this role in the community for a very long time through many different uses, but all that bring, that are pretty much, the code says you can have a education use, public library, or municipal building. So that right now, it has been used for municipal meetings and offices and things. So I think, we're actually bringing it into conformance rather than further extending the non-conforming use. But, so I think, they are very intertwined.
Beth, I would think one of the, issues that you look at when it comes to uses is the impact of a use. And, that's why they say, well, sewer treatment plants go over here. Garbage disposal and the dump goes over here. So what it then, by inference, makes one look at in evaluating the type of use, it would basically, I believe, cause the board to have to interpret the impact of, say, a yoga studio compared to a maybe a continuous use like a school, or continuous use as the clerk's office most recently. But then again, maybe that was tentatively, and basically you would almost say it was a matter of an emergency, that the clerk's office suddenly put their offices in another location, maybe for lack of, first of all, they needed probably in or around the village, but for lack of other options, and for the emergency that there was asbestos in the Phillipstown Hall building. So, I mean, all these things have to be looked at. I think primarily when it comes to the zoning and use, the real concern is impact, and then it's an evaluation of the impacts of the varying uses. And to take it further, if we're looking at whether a pre-existing non-conforming use has been extended or not, as far as its impacts, are there greater impacts at all? So I think in part it's looking a little bit in that direction, unless any board members have other thoughts on that.
I mean, I'm checking boxes as far as, but I'm being careful, with, obviously existing building, existing parking, historical use. I'm checking those boxes, but correct me if I'm wrong, aren't we still first and foremost looking at the argument that the project actually complies with the code, and that the error in the finding was, as part of the clarification for me was the misclassification, which was why it came to us to begin with. So, I guess while I say I'm acknowledging that I'm checking boxes, if we go that route, aren't we just finding that it actually, or aren't we just interpreting that it currently exists as complying with code, or it doesn't?
Yeah, I think from what I take from what Beth said, these two arguments are somewhat in tension, and I think the way to organize them is, the first argument is that the proposed use is in conformity and complies with the code, and if the board should reject that, then the applicant would fall back on the second argument, which is that if it is not compliant, it's just part of a continuous non-compliant use. So that second argument, I mean, they're saying opposite things. One is saying it's compliant, and the other one is accepting that it's non-compliant. So I think they can only be considered one at a time, and the second one only comes into play if the first one fails.
And alternative arguments can always be raised, in any matter. So it's not like you're contradicting yourself or saying I acknowledge that this might be a weak point or not. It's just a proposed argument.
Right, because these are interpretations, and it's which interpretation is correct is the one we're looking for. Beth, does that description satisfactory to you?
Yes, but I suppose, but how do you count for, if you're saying, I guess if you don't agree with following New York State requirements as it states in the code is following the code. So we're proposing a school that follows regulations. The code is saying it's a permitted use if you follow New York State Department of Education requirements. So if you say it's not following those requirements, then we're asking to continue a use that would be permitted already. Yeah, I'm not, it just doesn't quite make sense to me, but I think if we can focus on the interpretation that this is a permitted use, and look at that first, and then if you feel that this is not meeting those requirements, and then maybe we can discuss the implication of continuing use, and if it is a continued use, or if it is, you know, yeah, I think that makes sense to me, if that makes sense to you.
All right. Yeah, it does. Thank you.
I'll say I agree. My preference is to evaluate this based on that first argument. And to me, I find it convincing. I guess I have one question about it, which is just that, as Karen explained, there's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of problem with completing the paperwork. And so is that a concern for the board, or is there a way that we could make something contingent upon receiving approval, or do we just, I'm curious how we want to address the fact that they need our decision before receiving this kind of confirmation from the Department of Education.
Yeah, and Laura, if I may just say that in terms of part of the reason why the process is designed to be comprehensive, because for obvious reasons they don't want anyone to just randomly sort of think that they can start a school. Because I mean, I think what we've experienced through this is, they put you through a rigorous 5-week training session that Karen went through. We have to do everything that is involved with the structure, which involves fire safety, all of that stuff. Obviously, qualifications. In this case, Karen has been a teacher in various capacities over the last 20 years. So in terms of, whether the licensing will come through, we are very confident. It's just the process of, filing all this paperwork and having that come through. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but we are essentially just checking all the boxes. The last thing that's left literally on our list of things to do is, once we have the paperwork, once we sign the lease and the lease documents go to, we just need the insurance. So that's essentially what's left for us to do.
And Laura, without the approval of the OCFS, I don't think I can function anyways. So it's kind of, I need to have that approval in order to function.
Yeah, Laura, I think that if the board accepted that first argument, the kind of conditionality that you mentioned would be built into the resolution, because the resolution would say something to the effect that schools that follow requirements of the Department of Education are permitted as of right in R1. This school, when and if this applicant completes voluntary registration with the Department of Education, she will be following regulations of the Department of Education. Therefore, her project is permitted as of right under this code provision. And then if she failed, say, to get the registration, then the resolution doesn't apply to her anymore. And if she went ahead and opened the school anyway, she would be in violation,
That makes sense.
a zoning violation.
Thanks.
So Laura, you're right about, making it contingent, and I think that's what you just said, right, Eric?
Yeah, I think it would be built into the logic of the resolution.
Right, and I think going through this analysis, and you mentioned that there was a two-step, view of whether or not in this interpretation, and I think we all have to go through the number one item first about whether the Department of Education requirements, because as you say, if it's met, if it's satisfied, then it's as of right.
Right.
And it doesn't get into the variables of pre-existing non-conforming use and us weighing the impacts. So, we have to go through number one first. We don't just deal with number two in case we think we're not sure about number one. We should really just come down with a statement as to number one, Department of Education requirements.
Correct. Any more comments as part of the public hearing from anyone? Will someone want to move that we close the hearing?
I move that we close it.
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Right, so the hearing is closed. Board members, let's talk about our thinking on the application. Heath, you have something?
I'm comfortable with the interpretation that this complies. I think I'm at the point where I keep having to remind myself not to get into the community aspects as far as benefits. So I'm simply comfortable at that point.
Yeah, to me, it boils down to a pretty cut and dried consideration when you read the state regulation on, or the Department of Education's regulation on voluntary registration, and it says that it entails meeting the standards set forth in this part. And you look at the standards that follow throughout 125, and it's just a long list of requirements about the building, the fire safety, the teacher qualification, et cetera. And the applicant will be, has committed to completing that registration process. So, if that to me could not be a more clear case of what our zoning code calls meeting requirements. And it does not say licensing, it just says meeting requirements of the Department of Education.
I agree.
Can I ask a question or no, because the hearing's over?
Well, the hearing is closed.
Okay. Understood, that's
All
fine.
right, thank you. John and Laura, do you see anything else here to that weighs in?
I don't. I agree with this, and I think that I also agree with the conclusion that we are not evaluating these community benefits or impacts, that it's purely looking at this request interpretation of the code. And I also appreciate, Eric, your suggested language around making it contingent for these certifications.
I always think it's useful in these matters to back up a little bit and just ask oneself, when contemplating a decision, ask oneself, does this really make sense, common sense in the light of what the code says? And so just, I try to ask myself, in this case, why is this provision in the code? Why is there this schools permitted only if they meet Department of Education requirements? And I can only assume it's to restrict schools to well-established, well-run, well-managed institutions. And I think that purpose is achieved here with this particular school because of the way it does meet the regulations that are entailed in the voluntary registration.
Yeah, so Eric, yeah, thanks for outlining all this. And again, we go back, as you indicated, to the language of the code, schools meeting State Department of Education requirements. And, you know, I am very much in, agreement in the direction you're going. And the only thing and as far as the code language is concerned, as I went through it, I didn't find anything that, there's not that much information in the code to help define school education requirements. And the only thing I was going to do was to just double check legal research in that area. Otherwise, I'm agreeable to like a contingent interpretation that we simply apply the language of this code. And if they meet the requirements, that's fine. And the whole issue I'm concerned about is where does the idea of licensing fit in? And I just want to make sure that we've done the right thing by meeting the definition here in this code of what the Department of Education requirements expect. And that's my only concern. I really don't have a concern. I mean, I think the school would be a valuable asset. I know there might be impacts, but we're not dealing with that right now. We're just talking about an interpretation, and it wouldn't be necessary. It wouldn't involve a variance, obviously, if it met this definition. So the last thing I was going to do was just to do the legal research in here and just try to flush out what it expects in regards of Department of Education requirements. How broad is that? The language. And that's my only concern. And this way I know that we're abiding by what the code says.
You mean whether there's any guidance on how to understand the term requirements here?
Yeah, that's all. I just haven't had the chance. I just finished a 160-page grant application for 7 projects for the state parks. I had that in on Saturday. So I put enormous volunteer hours into that. So I've been rather consumed on that, and as well as doing a pro bono will for a party on top of trying to get my work done. I meant to research this, and I just want us to be doing the right thing. That's all.
So you're suggesting there might be some kind of understood standard that schools must, throughout zoning code, throughout zoning law, that schools must be licensed by the State Department of Education, specifically licensed.
I'm not even saying that right now, because I don't know what the definition exactly is looking for, except for it seems pretty broad. And what happens is this language here in the code, we didn't just make it up. Nobody just made it up here. What they do is they borrow the language from other code provisions, from other municipalities. Yeah. And quite often, just as we're doing right now, they have to interpret, what does that mean? This is not the first situation where daycare came in, or whether it was a Montessori school, or this is not the first situation. So I needed to do legal research on that because I was preoccupied with other volunteer work. I didn't get to do the legal research on this once I saw the papers that came in, which I did read. So that's where I am. That's where I am on this at this point.
All right. So you would prefer to not reach a decision tonight and do
Well, I just
some-
want to be confident. I just want to be confident. That's all. And I'm,
So if I could just, John, in the discussion that we had earlier, I think it was before we closed the public hearing, there was the conversation of, actually, I don't think it was. I think we just had it moments ago, of contingency with, and where that falls in line with Laura's point of the chicken or the egg. Is the point that where I am is that I'm kind of the chicken before the egg, where it feels as though if the requirements are going to be met for the state, our piece falls first as priority. In order for that to happen, the contingency of meeting those requirements is built in. Would you be more comfortable if we somehow stated in the notes that the contingency is based upon that review? Or are you more comfortable pausing until you can do?
no, Heath, I'm all for, moving this forward, but I just want to make sure we do it correctly. And I think, as you say, we can do this with contingent language.
Okay.
John, I don't see how we could write a resolution that leaves open the possibility you're raising. If you persuade us that there is some understanding in zoning law that schools must be licensed to be acceptable in R1, if you persuade us of that, I don't know how we could write a resolution tonight that would allow for that possibility.
I would simply say we could write the resolution tonight by simply saying that that conforms with the definition in the code of schools meeting the State Department of Education requirements. And as that provision is generally interpreted, I don't know, what do you know the meaning behind that provision?
Yes, insofar as it consists of English, I do. Insofar as I can read plain English, I feel confident about understanding the meaning. Any other meaning that's there would be hidden meaning and inferred meaning. Requirements is a different word from licensing, and when I read requirements, I do not infer licensing because that's a different sense. And so I would not ever, I think we would be on shaky ground insisting that the applicant get licensing when all the code says is requirements. I think that would be hard to defend that, say, in the future in court or whatever, unless you found some real slam dunk case law or something that was like black and white, how every court in the state has always held that it must be licensing, something like that.
What did you, now you said you read through the State Department of Education requirements, correct?
Correct.
And nothing mentioned licensing.
No, she is not getting licensing from the Department of Education. That's clear, and she's not attempting to get it because it doesn't apply to her school. But she is following, she must, she is voluntarily following a registration process, which is different from licensing. And that process involves conforming to extensive requirements defined by the Department of Education.
And I just to build on that, I think that it shows a level beyond following requirements, right? You can follow requirements voluntarily that aren't, you can just do that. Or you can take another step to follow those requirements and then have that kind of checked off by that department through a voluntary registration. So, so in that way, I think it's like verification, extra verification out that those requirements are being followed. So that even, I think, goes beyond what is stated in the code.
Well, here's another way of putting it, to make a quick end to this, that they're seeking Department of Education approvals already, right?
Correct.
Okay, Well, if the Department of Education then approves it, then that's satisfactory to me. Unless I find there's bombshells out there, in the law. I just didn't have a chance to do it. I don't want to do guesswork on any of this. I didn't, but if the State Department of Education approves something with regards to the school here, and then, I have I'll at this point accept that approval as meeting the requirements.
Well, I think approval is definitely the correct term here, because she's following a prescribed process that is stated in writing, and she'll get back a written certificate showing that she completed it, and it will involve a personal inspection by a state representative.
Yeah, because I'm personally not an expert in Department of Education requirements, but I can understand the word approval.
Okay. I don't know that whether the word approval is used, but it's the same thing. A school shall be registered by the department upon the submission of satisfactory evidence that it meets the standards set forth in this part, for approval, and receives approval after on-site visitation.
There you go. See, this is what I was getting to, right? I didn't even read the state law out there, and yet I would know what it would say. That's why I got a job at the Appellate Division First Department.
It just comes to you in waves mentally.
What it is, it's logic. But the idea is that, nobody can really guess at things. You have to sort of know. And I was reasoning in my mind that logically, if you have approval from the State Board of Education, reading this code language that we have, to me, that's satisfactory.
Okay. So I will make a motion that that the board approve the applicant's request, that the board overturn the building inspector's denial, and because the board has found that the applicant is meeting requirements of the Department of Education and obtaining the approval from that department. And that is exactly what is mandated in Code Provision 134.7, which allows her to open the school as of right in an R1 district.
I would modify that to the extent that I would say, I agreed with what you said with regards to the building inspector's statement, but adding in that that if this is a resolution we're adopting at this point, or that the applicant get the Board of Education approval of having this school.
Yeah, it would be the resolution, and I'll send it to you first for approval, but the logic of it would be something like that any applicant who obtains this voluntary registration, or any applicant who successfully completes the voluntary registration process and receives the approval of the department, has met the requirements of the Department of Education as stipulated in Zoning Code 134.7.
Right, good.
And because, and
So-
just so I'm on the same page, because this is an interpretation, this applies to other similar scenarios. This isn't
Yes,
particular to this application. It's our interpretation of the code that would then apply in other cases. Is that right?
That's accurate.
that's correct. So it means that's why the resolution should be written as narrowly as possible and but not tailored to this particular case, to these facts.
Yes.
It's just saying that go ahead.
Oh, great. But
Just saying
yes,
that.
I understand.
Okay, that, right. So as I said before, so that was, that's my motion.
I seconded it.
Okay. All in favor?
I
So the voting is unanimous in favor. So Karen, the board will create a resolution that expresses the decision, and you'll get a copy of it, and so will the building inspector.
And Eric, note in that decision, it's contingent on the approval.
Well,
Oh, we're just doing the interpretation, so just let that
yeah,
go.
it will amount to that, because it will say completing this voluntary registration
Right.
and receiving the approval, it satisfies the provision of the code. So if she doesn't, if for some reason she fails to get that registration, then she doesn't fit the description in the resolution anymore. And if she goes ahead and opens anyway, then she's in violation, just like anyone who gets a permit but then goes ahead and does something else that doesn't conform to the permit. They're in a violation.
Yeah, and so the last thing, when we write the resolution, just so that future boards may know why we did this and how we came to it, I think we should also reference that Department of Education language you just read.
Definitely, that's key to the rationale. And I also am going to add this voluntary registration that she's applying for has a 5-year term. It expires in 5 years and must be reapplied for. So I'm going to mention that it involves continuous maintenance of that registration in place. It can't be allowed to lapse.
Well, that's right. And the other thing is, there are two things here. First of all, we've just basically defined what the code says here. And let me look at this 1 second. There's an issue typically with use. For instance, like, this isn't a situation where we're doing a permitted use because the use is already provided for specifically. So this is not sort of, in a sense, a variance of a use that you would give permission for, but once that use that the applicant came in for was discontinued, it would no longer be running with that property down the line. Does that make sense? There's such a thing as a permitted use, meaning that it is specific to the applicant, and that if that applicant discontinues the use does not run with the property itself for future down the road.
Is that something? Is that connected to the special use permit you're talking about?
Yeah.
Because this does run with the property. The right to open a school in that.
No, I understand that. I'm saying this is different, because we're interpreting this such that it does simply apply with this language. They're using the property for what the language permits. I mean, allows. I don't want to use the word permit in this case.
Well, the interpretation will mean that anyone who comes along in the future who completes this voluntary registration.
That's right. I agree with that. I'm not limiting it. I'm just making the court. I'm just making the board aware that there is another type of use permit out there. So what I'm saying is that what the board's agreeing. Yeah, what the board here is agreeing to is that this covers this property in perpetuity, because basically it's not like we're granting them anything. It's already written in the code.
Right. And that's important to note for neighbors who may be unhappy about having a school next door. It was not this board's decision to allow schools in R1. That was written by the authors of the zoning code. It was their decision to allow schools in R1, and it's always been permitted.
Right, that's understood, but then you're ignoring the second point, but that's fine. I'll do that with my lawyer. It's okay. I understand all the logic. I completely hear everything you're saying. It makes perfect sense. I follow your through line definitively. Thanks.
So to kind of follow up on what John was saying, I guess you're referring, John, to cases where someone comes to us with a use variance request.
That's right.
They want an exception, like they want to be able to open something that's not normally permitted. And if we allow it, then that runs with the property, even though it's non-conforming. Is that what you're, and you're saying this is?
So, yeah, what a permitted use is, it doesn't necessarily run with the property going forward. It's a use that you sometimes have to apply for annually. It all depends on how it's written. This is not the case here, because the language here allows. So we're not looking at something where the language says it allows schools in the R1. So it's not like you're putting a sewer treatment plant in and you're simply saying, well, you know, if you're going to operate that here in the R1 zone, because it's not already designated. In this case, schools are designated in the R1 zone. Since it isn't designated, but we're going to allow you to do it, we're only going to give you a use permit to do it, a permit for however long you operate, or if we say it's only for a period of years, or if you have to reapply every year and we can simply shut you down when you reapply. So I'm just making the board aware that since we're on the topic of use, this is the way it works typically. So we don't have to be worried about that, but just so there's no confusion going forward. It's like an education lesson a little bit.
Okay, thanks, John. So that completes 34 Campbell Avenue application. Thank you, everybody who came for that. And the board will now move on to the final item on the agenda, which is to review the minutes for the last meeting. You should have gotten the minutes in email the day after the last.
What was the date of that again? Just so that I can pull it up quick.
March
Yeah,
5th.
a little bit 3-5.
Thank you.
It was March 4th, and we received them on March 5th.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for writing them.
I think that in the section on the public hearing for 212 Main Street, we need to straighten out, there were two threads or two topics that we went over, and they're kind of mingled together here a little bit. As I recall, first we dealt with an issue that John Martin led us through, the question of whether, I believe, it was involved whether the overhangs, the second floor overhangs should be counted toward lot coverage. And we spent a while on that and concluded that we didn't have concrete guidance in the code, so we would leave that, give the applicant the benefit of the doubt on that. and assume that lot coverage did not change. And that was point number one. And then point number two was dealt with section 134-19H, which is the fact that the second floor overhangs increase pre-existing non-conforming dimensions. So first the lot coverage issue created by the overhangs, and then the increase in the non-conforming dimensions, which is not permitted under 134-19H. This language combines them a little bit. So first of all, is that recollection about the sequence of those two topics? Am I right about that?
We looked at the two of them as separable, as you indicate.
Yeah, so where the paragraph that ends, J. Martin seconded and the motion passed unanimously. It's from that point on that I think we need to separate the two topics. First, I think we need to say something like, starting with that second bullet point, we need to say something like the second floor. It's not the roof overhang, it's the floor itself. The overhang of the second floor, and it's not that it should be considered, it's more like the board next discussed whether the second floor overhang increased the pre-existing non-conforming lot coverage. Then code doesn't give positive direction for interpretation of this code provision. So therefore, J. Martin made a motion that the code is unclear, and the ZBA should declare the issue in the applicant's favor.
I think you can correct it the way you're stating it right now, because that is my recollection of what we discussed.
Okay. And then it would go on and say, then the ZBA discussed 134-19H, and then closed the hearing. Or rather, you could say something like the ZBA discussed 134-19H and determined that a variance to that provision was needed because the overhang increased pre-existing non-conforming dimensions. And then closed the hearing. We closed the hearing, and then we went through the 5 criteria, applying them to 134-19H.
That's right. That's my recollection.
Great. Absolutely mine as well.
That
That
sounds
sounds
fine
like
to me.
Laura?
Yep.
All right. And then the only other thing I would change is below under the workshop, applicant wishes to open a Montessori school which enrolls students aged 3 to 6. The next sentence is not accurate. It should say something like a non-public school for this age group is licensed by the Office of Children and Family Services, not by the NYSDOE.
That's right. That's right. And that's what was discussed today, again.
Yeah.
I think we should change under the discussion. It was noted that, and then a ways down it says code allows schools in the R1 district if they have NYSDOE certification. It's not certification. It's whatever the language is in the code about requirements.
Requirements, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. If they meet requirements of NYSDOE.
Yeah.
And below that, applicant has 3 options. I would expand that first one to say meets all the criteria for a use variance.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and then just reference to the code provision. 134-7A. see that.
Okay.
No.
Does the second bullet, would that have also required an interpretation?
Yeah, that's just, the second and third are both interpretations. So I think the second one should say, submit a new application for an interpretation establishing that proposed use is a pre-existing use.
Mhm.
And the third one could start with the same language, submit a new application for an interpretation establishing that the application complies with the code.
Yes. Makes sense.
The fourth bullet just needs to read, Town of Phillipstown has held classes.
Yeah, okay.
So I see no other changes needed. I would move to approve them as modified pursuant to our stated changes.
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I,
Okay. Thank you, everybody. That's everything for tonight, unless anyone has other business.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody.
I was
What's
John, you're
that?
coming in and out.
Someone's got to make a motion.
Yeah, okay. Well, so we don't have anything on the agenda for the next meeting, but something may come up, but I will let you know. I
Okay.
don't know of anything right now.
So we had to do, all right, we made all motions except for adjourn the hearing, right?
Correct. I
right.
move that we close the hearing, or close the meeting tonight.
Close the meeting.
All in favor?
Who seconded it?
Lauren,
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
I second it.
Thank you all.
Everyone, take care.
Cheers.
Michael's last meeting, so thank you, Michael, and
Thank you,
Thank
goodbye.
you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. See you around the quad.
That
You're the
sounds
man.
good.